kind enough to invite me here to give a little talk on the Raspberry Pi. And since there's a fairly small number of people here, and since I couldn't get my computer display and the screen when I get down to the demo side of things, I'll just turn my computer on and everybody can come up front and we can sort of look at it that way. But I'll tell a little bit about my computing experience that sort of got me interested in the Raspberry Pi. I've been fiddling with Linux in various incarnations since about 1999, and one of the first commercial experiences I had with Linux was a company I was working for bought something called the Cobalt Cube, which was a small business appliance. And interestingly enough, it ran on an ARM processor. It had 256 megs of memory, had a 20 gig hard drive, and it was just a little tiny box, and it could do all sorts of stuff. Ran web servers and mail servers and file sharing and all sorts of different stuff like that. Through that, I sort of got interested in small form factor and low power computing, so I've gone through various VIA technology, mini ITX, micro ITX, Pico ITX boards and so forth like that.
What did that cost?
The Raspberry Pi or the Cube?
Yeah.
Oh, it was pretty expensive. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of like $1,000 or something like that. They were eventually bought up by Sun Microsystems. Anyway, so I had an interest in Linux and small form factor computing, low power computing for, like 12 or 13 years now. So a little over a year ago, I was walking through Fry's Electronics, and out of the corner of my eye on one of the Linux magazines there, I saw the cover story. What are you going to do with your Raspberry Pi? I didn't think much of it, but then I bumped into an article about it later on and read about it, and then I was at Fry's Electronics, and there were more articles about it. By then, it came out in February last year. I thought, I've got to get myself one of these, and then I read that it was very difficult to get your hands on. They were hard to get, they were slow to be manufactured and so forth like that, so I forgot about it until May or so, and then I decided, I'm just going to put in an order, and I don't care how long it takes to get it. And since it seems to take forever, I'm going to order 4 of them because they're only $35 a pop. And I got in on a window of opportunity, and like a week later, I had 4 Raspberry Pis in my hand, and I've since distributed the other 3 to 3 of my friends that are into it. But so that's sort of how I got into the Raspberry Pi. So what's the point of the Raspberry Pi? Well, the guy who's the founder of the RaspberryPi.org is a guy named Evan Upton. He's now a chip designer for Broadcom, which is the company that makes the chip that runs the whole thing. But at the time, he was a professor of computer science at Cambridge University, and what he and some of his colleagues noticed over the course of the years is that people going to, a top-rate school like Cambridge came in literally knowing absolutely nothing about computing. They were really good on Excel, and they could play games, and they could, configure a printer and so forth like that, but they literally had absolutely no idea of what's going on at either a hardware or a software level. So they decided that they would come up with some sort of a cheap computer. So they decided they wanted to do it at a really low price point, $25 to $35, so that it could be purchased in bulk by schools and third world countries and hobbyists. And interestingly enough, one of the reasons why they wanted it to have a really low price point is because it actually encourages you to not only work on the software side of things, but also on the hardware side of things. And if you're like me with a soldering iron, I would not put a soldering iron anywhere near my MacBook Pro, but if I put it near my Raspberry Pi and I drop a blob of solder on something, I'm out $35. It's not the end of the world. So they came up with that. So they wanted to produce something that you literally could not do anything with without learning something about computer science, software, hardware, and so forth like that. The Pis were they first manufactured them in Asia, and the reason why they made them over there in China was because there were no local outfits in the UK that could actually manufacture them at a low enough price point in the numbers that they had anticipated, because they were actually anticipated making thousands of them as opposed to hundreds of thousands or millions of them. But they've actually now made and sold more than 1 million of them. It's exceeded their wildest expectations, and they have now moved their manufacturing to a Sony plant, which is a contract electronics manufacturing facility in Wales, and so they're actually making them now in the UK, and they can still now make them at that low price point. In fact, the first one that they put out, which is the one that I happen to have, is the $35 model, which initially came out with 256 megs of RAM on it, and now they've got a different model that is a $25 model, and the difference there is it doesn't have a network adapter on it. But now the model that I have that has a network adapter, the $35 model, now is up to 512 megs of memory. So again, the specs on this thing are you'd think that they were minimal, but actually this thing is a more powerful computer than the Cobalt Cube that 10 or 12 years ago thought cost $1,000. It's pretty amazing. So what it uses is a Broadcom multimedia processor. It's composed of an ARM chip that runs at 700 megahertz. Now you can overclock them. I'm not into that because even though the price of failure is fairly low, I still don't want to burn out my $35 Raspberry Pi. But anyway, so it's got a 700 megahertz ARM processor. It's got a Broadcom dual core video media coprocessor, which is, you'll see, it's totally amazing that a computer with specs like this can do what it can do. A lot of the processing is thrown off onto the graphics processor, so you'll see that. It's got 2 conventional USB connectors, and then it's got a micro USB connector also. It's got, for audio output, it's got an HDMI that outputs both audio and video. Did I say audio? Anyway, for video, it's got an HDMI that puts out video and audio. It's got an RCI, or an RCA jack, so you can plug it into a TV through a composite video. It's got, and it's also got a 3.5 millimeter audio jack on it. It runs off of an SD card. I'm using an 8 gig card that I pulled off one of my cameras, but you can run it off as little as a 2 gig SD card. This one that I have has a 10/100 Ethernet port. The reason why they didn't go to a gigabit port was because actually this Ethernet port on here is sort of a pseudo Ethernet port. It actually truly connects in the wiring to a USB to Ethernet adapter somehow within the hardware of it. It has just about any kind of connectivity that you can possibly think of. The thing that got me really interested in it is it has a UART, a UART, which is actually used for serial communications. And the company that I work for, believe it or not, still uses serial communications for various devices to talk to our hotel property management software. And I thought, wouldn't this be really cool to be able to set up an emulator to emulate incoming and outgoing serial communications on a $35 piece of hardware, which, by the way, I've never gotten around to doing. It's got all sorts of other connectors. One of the things that I'd sort of hoped to do with it, which as of yet I haven't, is control heating and ventilation and air conditioning, which a lot of people actually have succeeded in getting to work. So, that being said, and since we only have 10 minutes left, let me do a little bit of a demo. So first, let me show you the Raspberry Pi. And I think probably, come on up, because I was out of a camera. That's the size of it right there. It comes with one instruction in the box. One instruction. The one instruction says, do not place on conductive surface. That is the only instruction you get with it. Everything else, you're on your own. And it literally does nothing. You can literally do nothing with it without learning some command line Linux stuff. So it's pretty cool. So I'm going to plug it in. It doesn't come with a case or anything. Now there's all sorts of cases and so forth like that you can buy with it. It's really used a lot within the makers movement these days, and a lot of them will go out and contract with shops to do laser cut custom cases and so forth like that. So where does it get its power from? It actually gets its power from, well, there's 2 ways of doing it. one of which is just a conventional cell phone charger. It's a 5-volt charger, and then the other way is I can run it off of this thing here, which I will in a minute, but first I'm just going to boot the thing up, and there's no on-off switch either. You just plug it in, it starts to boot. You can see it flashing a little bit, and I'm gonna plug it in so that we'll have some network connectivity, and it's picking up an IP address off of my router here, and if we're lucky, it's pretty durable, by the way. I mean, I've dropped it off the table and you know, piled stuff on it accidentally. It's very durable. I'm gonna connect into it with an SSH session. First, I want to see if I'll get rid of that for a minute. Okay, so it's booted up. It's returning a ping. So I'm going to SSH into it right now. This session that we'll soon be seeing is actually not running on my Mac. It's actually, we are now on the Raspberry Pi right now. So
you SSH'd onto your
I
Raspberry?
SSH'd on. I usually run it headless when I have it at home, because I'm actually using it for some real stuff with Debian, which is sort of the base of like Ubuntu and other things like that. But it's just a conventional Linux operating system. It's fairly stripped down. Since they want to have people be able to program with it, they addresses with different networking vendors. So I'm gonna just ping around my small network here a little bit. So I'm just pinging to my router here, and now I will ping over to the Pi itself, which will return a ping. And now I'll ping over to the MacBook Pro, which I think is .5. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to do an ARP-A command. And what this does is this is actually showing, this is not running through the Raspberry Pi, but it's actually showing what vendors and so forth like that the equipment are. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my ARP-A command, and I'm going to pipe that into a little Python program I wrote that then goes and queries the database and will come back and tell us again what we have here. So it takes a little while because it's reading in a 400K database. By the way, on this 8 gig card, I've used about 4 gigs so far. So it now tells us that we have a MacBook Pro and a Cisco, and the vendor on the MacBook Pro is Apple, and the vendor on the Cisco is actually Cisco Linksys, which this is something I also sort of envisioned for work, because what we have a problem with a lot of times where I work is people will plug peculiar network devices into their network, and they'll hijack our IP addresses. And we run a hotel property management system, and the IP addressing scheme is pretty cut and dry. In other words, this box has to be on this address, and if you have something else on that address, the whole system doesn't. So I wanted to have something that would just, I could plug into the network that would look around, see what's on there, give me a name of the vendor, as opposed to manually having to do each one. So that's a little example of what can be done with Python programming. But more important, or more interesting to me, was could it actually be used as a real server? So what I did was I loaded a LAMP stack on there, so it's already running Linux. But I loaded Apache, MySQL, and PHP on there to see if I could do anything with a LAMP stack. And sure enough, I'm actually using this. Here's phpMyAdmin. So this web page, this phpMyAdmin web page, is actually running off of the Raspberry Pi here. And by the way I have my router set up, I've got outbound, or the wide world at large. I can connect into it through an encrypted link through my router and then into my Raspberry Pi if I'm out in the world. So anyway, what we have here is this PHP MyAdmin is a PHP web-based front end for a MySQL database. So I've got a little test database on here, and this is actually a real database that I'm using to collect names and addresses for another organization that I'm involved with, but it actually runs on the Raspberry Pi. So we'll go into the email table, and I'm just going to run an SQL query off of here. It's not real fast, as you can see, but it's, you know, a 700 megahertz processor with 256 megs of RAM. But one of the cool things about PHP MyAdmin is you can store a query. So I've stored up a few sample queries. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a query on this database to give me a count of how many people in a particular zip code have signed up for our email list. And so this query, there's 242 that didn't give a zip code, and there's 11 from 85260 and so forth like that. So this thing can actually be used for real work. It's really good for prototyping and so forth like that. Like, I'm eventually going to move this stuff onto a bigger server, but at this point I haven't. So the last thing that I will demo is, remember I said that this thing, you'd be amazed at what it can do with this dual core graphics processing unit. Okay, here we go. I'm going to turn this off, unplug it from, by the way, to turn it off you just unplug it. This device here is a docking station for a Motorola cell phone that never made it very big. And so there's a ton of these Atrix docking stations available for about 50 bucks a piece on eBay. So what I'm going to do is we'll hook the Raspberry Pi up in here. And by the way, you have to cobble together, you know, Rube Goldberg-like contraptions. But so this is a micro HDMI that we're going to plug in here. And we'll just plug our conventional HDMI connector in over here. And I had to sort of make a custom USB cable. So this is a micro USB female, which we plug in to this connector. And then we have this USB connector carries no power, but it carries data. And this one carries no data, but it carries power, and it's all soldered together inside of there and taped up and everything like that. So I will plug this in here. Oops. I don't need the MacBook Pro anymore. I will open this bad boy up. This has no processing or anything like that. It's basically a monitor, mouse, and keyboard. I have not yet figured out how to get the sound working on it, but there's no signal coming into it right now. So now we'll turn on the Pi, and the Pi is booting. And what will happen in a minute is, by the way, if I plug this into like a 40-inch big screen TV, it plays sound and video perfectly. I just haven't figured out how to get the sound working on this thing yet, but it uses H.264 format, which is what you would get that would run on an iPad or something like that. So it's it won't start the MySQL database when it's not on the network for some reason. I haven't figured that one out either. Anyway.
Do you have a card?
I don't, but I'll give you my email address.
The reason I ask is one of the organizations I worked with, they started out as a robotics club.
Yeah.
And they are this spring. They have kids, I'd say about age 10 to 14. Mm-hmm. And they're playing with that.
The Raspberry Pi, yeah, it's amazing. I'm gonna, just for giggles, I'm gonna bring up a GUI on here. I rarely use the GUI on this thing, but so now
I gotta run real quick.
Oh, sure.
If you mind. I will pass your name on to those folks.
Absolutely.
They meet on Friday nights, and the kids have built underwater robots.
All right.
Other kind of robots.
Yeah. Cool.
Bill's our robots guy.
So that's a regular GUI.
Look at that.
That's the Raspberry Pi GUI. I'm going to shut the GUI down, and I'm going to do one last thing. This will just take a second, if we're really lucky. Okay. One of the cool things about this being a Linux-based system is it replays all your commands, so I don't really need to remember what the commands are now.
So it runs Bash?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is an HD video being played off of a 700 megahertz processor computer, and it would do it on a big screen TV just as easily as it would on here, and it'll produce sound on a big screen TV. This is a weird Bob Dylan movie, Masked and Anonymous. So
And that's all on that SD
that's
card?
all on this. By the way, so I've got my MySQL database, I got PHP, I got Python on here. I have one movie, and I've only used about 400 or 4 gigs of the processor. So anyway, there we are. There's a movie running off of a little tiny Raspberry Pi. So that is basically all I have prepared. So if anybody has any questions.
What the kids, I think the guy that's helping the kids do that is they're designing games.
Yeah, there are actually some special game designing. There's game designing software included in the Raspberry and distribution, which I haven't gotten into. But
Yeah, they connect it to a monitor, and
yeah,
we're trying to get the kids just, get them familiar with the technology. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
yeah,
That was-
you're welcome.
Apologies.